Millions of early voting ballots have already been cast, with now just a little more than a week until Election Day. The margins are razor thin between two presidential candidates in multiple battleground states as they race to win over undecided voters. Now, during the final weeks of their campaigns, former President Donald Trump kept the focus on key issues such as immigration, while promising change if elected back to the White House. Meanwhile, Vice President Kamala Harris brought star power here to the Peach State, appearing with former President Barack Obama. CBS News' Jared Hill has the latest.
For the first time, Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Barack Obama took the campaign stage together, rallying in front of a Georgia crowd yesterday.
There's a choice that everybody has. It's either Donald Trump in there stewing over his enemies list, or me working for you.
The two highlighted reasons folks in the battleground should vote for Harris, rejecting former President Donald Trump.
Kamala Harris doesn't have concepts of a plan. She got a plan to make your life better.
The star-studded rally also featured appearances from rock legend Bruce Springsteen and movie legends with ties to the Peach State. Out west, Trump spent the day focused on immigration, speaking to voters in Arizona.
We're like a garbage can for the world.
And in Nevada, he denied his former chief of staff John Kelly's account that he praised Adolf Hitler's generals while in office.
No, I never said that. I would never say that.
Today, Texas takes center stage, Trump in Austin and Michigan, while Harris will focus on women's reproductive rights in Houston. Jared Hill, CBS News.
And to help break down Georgia's role in electing the next president of the United States is Kennesaw University political science professor Dr. Ben Taylor. Dr. Taylor, we have had you on Atlanta News First Plus a good number of times, and each time your expertise and insight has been so valuable. So I want to talk about Georgia's role in this race. I mean, the Peach State has historically played a vital say in who takes the White House in a presidential race. What cements it as a battleground state?
Well, what makes Georgia competitive right now, and battleground states, or swing states as you sometimes hear them called, are states that could go for either candidate, the Republican nominee or the Democratic nominee in a presidential election. And what makes Georgia a battleground state or a swing state is because the electorate is pretty evenly divided. We saw Joe Biden win a very narrow election in 2020 in Georgia, but of course we have all statewide offices in Georgia are won by Democrat or Republican politicians at this time. So we have a lot of competition between the Democratic and Republican parties in Georgia at the statewide level because we're a fairly evenly divided electorate between the Democratic and Republican parties.
And, you know, we talk about Georgia among a number of swing states that both campaigns are focusing on in this election. Polls are predicting a knife-edge race between Mr. Trump and Vice President Harris. That's remained largely unchanged despite the trips that they've made here to Georgia and their campaigning, strategies that we've seen play out over the past several months.
Right, and I think what that speaks to is the sort of larger trend that we've seen over the last 20 years in American politics of partisan polarization. We've seen Democrats become more solidly Democratic and Republicans have become more solidly Republican. 20, 30 years ago, you might have seen voters do more split ticket voting where they vote for Democrats in some races and Republicans in others. Increasingly, people are voting for a single party down the line. But again, though, that's for people who identify with these parties. There is, and this is evidenced by the nature of elections generally in a two-party system, there is a pool of independent or moderate voters who do not identify with the parties, and they are the swing voters. They're the voters who maybe don't pay attention to politics very much. They're not as interested in politics most of the time. And it's these voters who the candidates and campaigns typically, by the time we get close to the end of election season, they're really gearing towards trying to find out what motivates those voters first to come out and vote, and secondly, to make their voting choice for the candidate in question, either the Republican or the Democrat.
Yeah, I know there's no telling who Georgia is going to go to, but we can look at the past to analyze what the future might be. In 2020, Georgia went to President Joe Biden, and that was unexpected to many people. It was the first time that Georgia swung blue since 1992 when Bill Clinton took office. Could we see that happen again this time around?
I think it's very possible that Vice President Harris wins Georgia. Of course, the very nature of Georgia being a swing state, either candidate can win. But it is notable that Georgia has trended more competitive for some time. As you point out, 1992 was the last time that a Democrat had won Georgia before Biden in 2020. But if you look at 2008, 12, 16, there was a steady march toward a more competitive electorate for presidential elections in Georgia, despite the fact Republicans won pretty handily in all of those elections for the state of Georgia. But the bottom line is that this is sort of it's sort of a very similar scenario that we saw in 2020. You have Donald Trump, who is the Republican nominee, who does not seem to be an overwhelmingly positive candidate for most Georgia voters, as evidenced by his loss in 2020 and his closer race than many expected in 2016. So it makes a lot of sense that we're competitive now. The question is this a Trump effect, or is this a more competitive electorate overall? Because as I pointed out, all statewide elected officials at the state level in Georgia are Republicans, though we do have 2 Democratic senators and Senator Ossoff and Warnock. So there's some evidence that it's more competitive generally between the parties. But my sense, too, is that there's something of a Trump quality to this as well, and that he, as the candidate, makes it more competitive than it might otherwise be. If it was, say, Nikki Haley as the candidate, perhaps it's less competitive. But alas, that's not the reality we live in, and so we'll see how it goes.
For these 2 campaigns, I mean, we've seen very different strategies play out here. 2 interesting characters running for president, to say the least. With examining the campaign through its inception to, when Vice President Kamala Harris announced that she would taking the mantle from President Biden, and Trump coming out and saying that he's promising change and a new look at how the country should be ran. I mean, summarize to me what the 2 strategies, put simply, have been and what voters should take away from that.
Well, it's been interesting. You can tell what campaign strategy is by their paid advertisements, so what we see on television and radio, the ads that we see, and then also from their earned media opportunities as well. So they have rallies, they have speeches, and they have these sort of general talking points that candidates and campaigns go over with some frequency. And so you can sort of glean what they think their strategy is from that information. And it's pretty evident that the Trump campaign seems to be, in these closing days of the 2024 campaign, targeting sort of a base turnout model. They're trying to get their base voters out. They think in some sense that maybe the messages that they're playing in their ads have some play with independent voters. But in the end, it really looks like sort of a full court press on trying to get voters who love President Trump back out to vote. Whereas the Harris campaign seems to be running what I would call a more traditional presidential model campaign, which is you make sure your base is engaged and motivated, so you have rallies to sort of get them involved and generate volunteers and generate some fundraising activity. But the message of the campaign and paid advertising and candidate specifically, the presidential candidate, in this case Vice President Harris, that messaging is all about targeting moderate and independent voters. And you can see that in some of the ways that Vice President Harris has invited and had very high up Republican luminaries like Liz Cheney, and in fact, former Vice President Dick Cheney. They've endorsed her. Liz Cheney's been on the campaign trail. You've seen even some former Georgia Republicans, Jeff Duncan, for instance, have been out there sort of talking about Vice President Harris as the right choice. And that strategy, sort of that tacking to the middle, trying to attract the moderate independent voter, is a much more traditional strategy. But it's fascinating that they're going different directions, these campaigns.
You've said previously the Georgia voting, as we're seeing, early voting has shattered record numbers, and the Georgia voter is largely not left undecided. There's very few people that still haven't figured out who they're going to vote for if they are going to their polling place. And yet we keep seeing, these campaign stops in Atlanta, in Middle Georgia, in Coastal Georgia. What is the point of that? If we do understand, and the campaigns must understand, then most people have either voted or already have made up their minds.
Well, again, I think that the fact of the matter is that while we do have very large numbers of people voting early, and obviously those people have made their decisions because they've cast their ballot, the people who are remaining, the people who are left to vote, the portion of those people who we might consider undecided, it continues to grow, right? Because those folks have not cast their ballot. And you might imagine that if they had made their choice, they might go ahead and do it with early voting. So that's the calculation the campaigns are making, right? So the reason you keep coming back into a place like Georgia or any battleground state that has early voting is because you think, well, to the extent there are voters left out there, then they have not made their choice yet, and we need to keep the full court press, as I said before, on to make sure they know who we are, what we're about, and why we are the choice they should make. Furthermore, there are pools of people out there who may, to this point, not even really be engaged in the electoral process. So if your campaign thinks that there are people who haven't been paying attention much or who heretofore may not have even considered themselves to be likely voters, maybe coming to the state, having this media attention, having luminaries come in, like former President Obama or Bruce Springsteen in the case of Vice President Harris, then that kind of attention gives them sort of a window to those people to say, hey, look, we're having a campaign, come out and vote, and by the way, vote for us, right?
With the election so close now, take me through the mind of Georgia voters come election night, 7 p.m., when those polls close, when the last few folks standing in line have cast their ballots. What is next? Where does the attention go?
Well, at that point, it goes to the election administrators. So Georgia has 159 counties, and all counties are responsible for administering their own elections, and then they aggregate their votes and, tabulate their votes, send that data and information to the Secretary of State's office, who then tabulates the votes for the entire state. And then we figure out who wins, right? And that includes early votes, that includes absentee ballots, and obviously in-person election day votes as well. And so that is a massive administrative undertaking. However, the state of Georgia has been a leader on being more efficient in this process, and Secretary of State Raffensperger seems, in his public comments, seems very confident that we'll be able to know who won Georgia by some time on election night, barring any unforeseen circumstances.
Very well said. Dr. Ben Taylor, political science professor with Kennesaw State University, a political analyst here at Atlanta News First. We, again, can't emphasize enough how much we appreciate your perspective and expertise on all of this as many navigate this election and the days following. I just want to make sure I open the floor up to any final thoughts as we close out this election cycle and then begin to look at the outcome and what that means for the nation.
I just think that it's important that if you're a registered voter, you should go out and vote.
Very well said. All right, I want to point people out to our website, atlantanewsfirst.com. We actually have a special election tab for you that you can go to if you have the Atlanta News First app. It's a free app and a wonderful resource. You can get major updates on this election sent directly to your phone so you don't miss a thing. And you can read up on the recent campaign initiatives, strategies, and final push to get your vote for the presidential race and many other races we're following here in Georgia. With that, we are going to stay on top of all things elections here in Atlanta and around